Hi, everybody. My name is Todd Presner. I was the former director, actually, of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, and also involved in the Digital Humanities program from its inception. And so it's really great to have Tim Cole here, because he brings together not only Jewish studies and digital humanities, but also Holocaust studies and a number of other fields which you'll learn about today, particularly in the historical and environmental sciences. Briefly, let me just thank first the co-sponsors of the event today. That's the UCLA Program in Digital Humanities and the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, alongside, of course, of the Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And it's really a delight to welcome Tim Cole from the University of Bristol to speak today on our topic of digital mapping, digital humanities, and the Holocaust. I should also mention that Professor Cole will participate in another event on Thursday, which will be around a book talk with a couple of colleagues who are also here, Rachel Deblinger and Anu Bonazi. And that's a book called Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. I should say that both today's talk as well as Thursday's are made possible by the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish and Jewish Studies, and we thank their generous support. I also do want to thank the center staff for the arrangements of today's event, and just remind you about cell phones. Please, if you have to take a call, please just go outside, or during the talk, just keep them on silence. So briefly, let me introduce Tim Cole, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for now more than a decade, although I've known his work for even longer than that. And anyone who works in the field of Holocaust studies writ large, I'm sure, has come across his work, because it really hits on and really intersects with so many methodologies in the field, from history of Holocaust representation, practices of memory, testimony studies, memory studies, historiography, but more and more spatial and geographic aspects of the Holocaust. So oftentimes we've talked about and think about the Holocaust in terms of narratives, in terms of historical aspects, and sometimes we forget how embedded in spatial histories these narratives are. And sometimes those spatial histories can be things as elemental as a cellar, or a room, or a forest, or a river, or transit stations and things like that. But also they can, of course, be very large, the city, a street, the size of a continent. And how does one appreciate and understand those spatial aspects of where the events of the Holocaust took place, and how one represents the dimensions of space, especially vis-a-vis the fragility of the human body, right? Because our body is often our way of orientation, right, to what we see and what we can see. You think of like sound cones, what we can hear, or visual cones, what we can see, sometimes down a street. And so developing tools in the field of digital mapping helps us not only locate bodies in space, but also movement and possibilities for action and resistance and even knowledge. And I think at the core, many of these questions are I think, really fundamental to what digital mapping, and especially digital mapping of memory studies, is about. And Tim's research has helped me to really kind of conceptualize and think through this. He's a professor of social history at the University of Bristol, and also academic advisor to the Dan David Prize. Tim's research really is quite wide, as I mentioned, from social and cultural, environmental and landscape histories to Holocaust history, testimony practices, memory studies, but also digital humanities, and co-produced and mixed methodologies. And I think you'll see that in today's talk. His research is focused primarily on Holocaust landscapes, historical and memorial landscapes. And his first book, which came out in 1999, one which I think where I first learned about his work, when I was a very junior faculty member, Selling the Holocaust from Auschwitz to Schindler, How the Holocaust is Bought, Packaged, and Sold. Later, really just a few years later, he began investigating the spatiality of the Holocaust through Budapest, and published a book called Holocaust City, The Making of a Jewish Ghetto in 2003, which really began, I think, that work that you'll see today of investigating spaces of inclusion and exclusion and districts and changes in districts, walls, ghettos, movement, and looking kind of at a day by day in order to understand the history of ghettoization and its consequences for the victims. Since then, he's worked on a number of other books, and there's I'll just mention a couple in passing, but one on the history of the Hungarian Holocaust called Traces of the Holocaust, and another book called Holocaust Landscapes that came out in 2016, which is organized, and really this is methodologically so, I think, innovative and brilliant. It's organized by those sites of spatiality, like the ghetto, the river, the forest, the camp, the train, the road, the attic, the cellar, and linking these spatial experiences to testimonies and testimonial practices. He's been involved with another major project called the Geographies of the Holocaust Collaborative, which is where I sort of really met and got a chance to understand Tim's work almost 10 years ago now, and was part of a publication of a major book called Geographies of the Holocaust, where he was one of the major contributors along with Paul Jaskut and Ann Knowles. Some of the work that you'll see today on historical geographic information systems builds on that work. I understand that you're currently working on a project on the role of monuments in contemporary democracies, and I thought I'd mention that because what could be much as relevant, as important as our monuments in contemporary democracies, they certainly tell us a lot about what we care to remember and might remember, or what it's possible to still remember. So I'm very interested in that project as well. Without further ado, let me introduce Tim. I think it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really excited about your talk, and certainly to see the trajectories of your thinking around space and digital humanities and the methodologies that you'll introduce to us. Thank you. Move my stuff out of the way, and we'll take mine away.
I should change Todd to Tim.
There we go. I think that's yours, but that's mine. Do you want me to give you some water?
I'm good. I've got some water here. Thanks so much, Todd. That was like a beautifully generous introduction, wasn't it? I thought Todd was going to go through everything I'd written then. But I think it's lovely when someone else talks about your own work, because they kind of render maybe a sort of completeness to it that you don't always offer yourself. So thanks, Todd, for that. What I wanted to do was to reflect a little bit on this wider work that Todd mentioned of working as part of the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. And to start by thinking specifically about digital mapping and thinking about the intersections of digital humanities and space and place, and then to kind of broaden out a little bit at the end, more towards digital humanities, and in a sense I think that leads into Todd's and Rachel's book on ethics of the algorithm, which is the conversation we'll be having on Thursday, because I think there's a lot of overlap in the kind of thinking that we've been developing around a broader question of why use digital humanities approaches within history, specifically within this history, within Jewish studies or Holocaust studies, and what are some of the kind of ethical and historiographical implications of this. And I actually want to start with a quote from that book, but before I do, I just preface with this, just a couple of images. This is just using something called AntConc, so a freely available corpus linguistic software, looking at the use of pronouns. And I was thinking about this as I was reading Ethics of the Algorithm again. Todd writes in there at the beginning about how one of the things that computers do really well, or algorithms, is that they spot patterns that we don't see ourselves. And so this is a case of just a couple of interviews from the VHE archive, and it was part of a bigger project thinking about gender and pronoun use, where you have a husband and wife duo who have similar Holocaust experiences, and this is the use of I in the narrative. Every black line there is the use of I in the narrative. There were Helen on the top there, and then Morris underneath, and there's we. With a radically different way of rendering the story around egocentric. I'm particularly interested actually in that moment where Morris does switch to we. Is much more often associated in male narratives with the evacuations and death marches, where in a sense you become part of a kind of moving group of humans. But I start with that because I wanted to think about something like this at the end, but I really start with that because of this quote that really struck me from Todd's book, where he talks about intentional shifts between I and we subject to signal the contributions and multiplicity of voices engaged with the ideas. And I think this is something that Todd discusses a lot in the book with his collaborators, is the way that, in a sense, digital humanities shifts us in the humanities to much more a lab model of working, much more typical within the sciences, to much more co-authorship. And I really wanted to signal that because everything that I talk about today is not I, it's we. And it's a much broader set of people that I've been working with for the last 10 years or so. And I think, interestingly, as a scholar, if you think of the first part of my career and my training was very much that kind of traditional sole authorship model of the humanities PhD. And the second half of my career has been entirely all around co-authorship. I still write things on my own occasionally, but I think actually that probably there's something really valuable about that sense of collaborative working, especially in interdisciplinary ways within the digital humanities. And the group that we've gathered around us, and it kind of is a group that comes and goes and evolves, has really drawn together computer scientists, natural language processing specialists, ArcGIS, geographical information scientists, architectural historians, historical geographers. So a kind of whole range of disciplines that come to play. Great. What I want to do is start with this. So this is just something that we've been kind of thinking through as a group, is trying to think about what do we mean by space and place and cartography. So what are we mapping? Like, what is it we're trying to represent? And I think we've started to find this as quite a helpful way of thinking this through. It's from a book a long time ago now, 1989, so by Agnew and Duncan, but something that gains a certain kind of traction within human geography, which is to think about place and space as made up of a set of components. The thing that's in a sense easiest to map, which is location, which is to put a latitude longitude on the map and to say this is a particular point in Los Angeles that we can map with some kind of degree of certainty within the world. Second thing that they talk about, and I'm taking the quotes here, is from the work of Tim Cresswell, who's written really interesting, and I think has kind of riffed off this and developed it in interesting ways. He talks about locale as the material setting for social relations. So in a sense that every dot on the map is also something that has a materiality to it. It's a kind of structure of some sort. And as Todd said, that's one thing I've been really interested in, is writing the Holocaust through the lens of the multiple landscapes that a forest and a cellar and a river are very different kinds of material spaces and not just different dots on a map. But I think critically, the thing that Cresswell talks about, and I think I'll say a bit more about, is the criticality, the importance of social relations. So the sense that actually places, locales, are made up not just of architecture, but also the people we're with in the architecture. And so as well as having a latitude and longitude, the place where we are now is also a locale, which has a certain kinds of architecture to it, which is historically constituted at a very particular, we're in a kind of temple built to knowledge, aren't we, at a very particular moment in the 20th century. But we're also with a bunch of different people. We're within the wider context of a university community, which has a certain set of norms, and we're also with people who are either familiar or unfamiliar to ourselves. And I think that comes to the third thing, which in a sense is the hardest thing to map, but the thing that I think we're increasingly interested in is, like, actually what are the kinds of subjective experiences of space and place? So in a place like this, it has a latitude and a longitude, it has an architectural history, and it has a set of social relations, but it also has a sense of whether we feel welcome or not. And so for different people, the university campus may feel like a welcome or a not so welcome place, that we have different emotional and subjective attachments to a whole set of particular places. And I just put this up here because I think it's maybe a useful framing for just giving you a kind of, if this isn't too sort of meta, like a history of our work, or just the sense that I think what we've done is we've kind of moved from the first set of mappings through to the third. And as we've done that, I think we've also really shifted source type, and I want to say a lot more about sources, because I think we started off very much working with the Nazi perpetrator and collaborator archive. So we were really interested in initially mapping the archives of the perpetrators, and I think we've increasingly become interested in mapping the archives of the victims and the survivors in particular, thinking about testimony. Maybe I could just do a sort of greatest hits, just super quick, to introduce some of the work, and I start with the work of Alberto Giordano and Anna Hollian. What they do, and I think this is kind of interesting here, is this is an online tool where they took a post-war account developed by the Italian Jews, which shows all of the arrests of Italian Jews prior to deportation to Auschwitz in the period 1943 to 1944. And they began mapping it, including using animation as a way of dealing with the challenge of maps, which is that maps are often geographically sensitive but temporally pretty hopeless, because they cover like a big period of time. And I think one thing that has been really important for the group is to really grapple with that, because the group, in a sense, brings together historians and geographers. And the historians are always saying, like, but when did it happen? And like, what's the order of these things happening? And so one of the things that we've really developed is a whole series of animations, and you can run this through as an animation tool, which allows you to start to explore the patterns. The pattern that I think is particularly interesting is this, and I think this is where location in particular, inflected with other data, is really valuable still, which is just to ask the question, a very simple question with maps, is like, where did something happen? And in this case, it's asking, where did the arrests by German forces take place of Italian Jews, and where did the arrests by the Italian local police take place? And what you get is these very different spatial patterns. You get a spatial pattern of very large numbers of Jews in a small number of very large cities within Italy, versus a kind of wrap-up campaign, like mopping up, if you like, with a kind of final later period of arrests all the way across the country where local knowledge is critical. And I think a map like this is a map that starts to ask questions about why there were such different spatial patterns across these two perpetrator groups. And it also starts to point to the critical role played by Italians in collaborating with the Nazis within Italy in the arrest and deportation of Italian Jews. And it's a simple example, I think, of the kind of most basic map where I think there is still a value to mapping location. I guess the nice thing about using digital mapping like ArcGIS is that you can start to bring in multiple layers of data. And so here you can just, in a sense, map everything, like were men and women arrested in different places at different times? What are the variables that are potentially useful? And here, this is the variable that stands out as the most significant, I think, is that you get a very different spatiality to German and Italian arrests. Just a second example, which I really love, is the work of Paul Jascott, who Todd's mentioned already, and Anne Kelly-Knowles and others. And what they did, and I think this is a really interesting piece of work because I think it was inspiring for us, was what happens when you take an archive, the stuff that we work with as historians, and just try and visualize it. So what happens when you take an entire archive and just try and bring it to life in some ways through using visualization as a tool? And the archive they took was the Architectural Office archive from Auschwitz. Auschwitz is unusual in the blueprints surviving. In most camps, the blueprints are destroyed, but in Auschwitz, the Architectural Office survives. And so it's possible to start rendering that through visualization. This is just showing one of the visuals from there, which is a series of timestamp maps from August 43 through to December 43, showing which buildings are under construction in Birkenau. If you've been to Birkenau, you'll see this is where the entrance to the camp is, the main entrance, the two big gas chambers here, women's camp off to this side, men's camp off to that side. So you can just see a kind of visualization, a rendering. This is through December 43 into February 44. And here's a view shed looking from the gateway and thinking about the period May 43 to May 44. And every single building that's under construction in that critical period in the history of the camp. Now, what I think is really striking about this is that for Paul, this was a kind of moment of revelation as a historian, because he knew the archive, but he'd never seen it in this kind of way. And I think, Todd, that's something you write about in that book, that I think, again, this idea that often using computational methods or visualization methods maybe help us to see things in a different way than we normally see and normally read as historians as we kind of work our way through an archive, because it suddenly reimagines Auschwitz as a construction site. In the critical period 43 through 44, prior to the Hungarian deportations in the summer of 44, Auschwitz was a massive building site. And what's really striking, I think, is that presented opportunities. It's the moment of the greatest number of prisoner escapes, because it's a chaotic site. And in some ways, I think this kind of challenges maybe a sort of more like Chomskyan notion of the panopticon, or kind of Auschwitz as a sort of hyper-modern space. In a sense, Auschwitz is a hyper-modern space, but Auschwitz is also a chaotic, muddy building site for a critical period of his existence. And I think this is one of those cases where visualization really kind of casts a new light upon thinking about the camp. Just third example, some of the kind of older work, and I'll move into some more recent work, is some of the work I did with Alberto Giordano on thinking about Budapest. It's a place that has a very unusual ghetto. So it's a ghetto that's highly dispersed all the way across the city. It's about 2,600 apartment buildings that are designated for Jewish use in the summer of 44, and then drop down to 1900 apartment buildings, and that's where Jews in Budapest are living through the summer and autumn of 1944 into the winter of 1944. The deportations don't take place in Budapest, so they're stopped by the Hungarian region, Admiral Horthy. So Jews from all around Hungary are deported to Auschwitz, Birkenau, but not from Budapest. So this is where most Jews in Budapest, they're living in these big apartment buildings through the summer and autumn of 44. Now, one thing that I think is important if we're thinking about location and locale is that, as anyone knows, a dot on a map hides as much as it reveals. Because anyone who's been to a Central European city like Budapest knows that not every dot on the map looks the same. In the centre of the city, you have large apartment buildings, big gateway, courtyards, 4 stories. In the outskirts of the city, you have very small family houses. And so one of the things that digital mapping allows you to do is to start adding extra layers onto the map. In this case, what we did was we took census data, and so we could start to layer the map and start to, if you like, make the dots bigger and smaller according to how many people are living there and what's the size of these particular properties. So in a sense, to start bringing locale into conversation with location to try and think about and render in some ways, in a kind of simplified ways, the sense of the city as having an architectural history to it, with smaller homes, smaller dots in the outskirts, and some very large dots in the centre of the city. Now, what I think was particularly important for that was that you get a very different rendering of that map than that map if you start to layer it with census data, which is that actually it suggests that despite the archive suggesting this massive shift in the number of ghetto houses from 2,600 to 1,900, actually the centre of gravity hardly moves at all of the ghetto. And that suddenly you're dealing with a story which is much more around continuity than change. Which in a sense makes you as a historian ask different questions, doesn't it? Because if you go to the archive, and I've done that, and you read all of the petitions and you read all the documents, you think, wow, everything changed enormously. But if you start rendering it this way, you think, actually, maybe I need to start asking, why did things not change so much? And indeed, why did things not change so much all the way across 1944, from initial plans at the bottom left, through this central period in 1944 to the later period in the end of 1944 and 45, where Jews are placed into ghettos? That in a sense, what seemed to happen in this city was that all of these plans had 2 districts in the city at the very core of the plans, the 2 districts in the city where 2 different Jewish communities lived. Poorer Jewish community in the centre of the city and a richer Jewish community just to the north of them. And I'll say a bit more about them in a moment. And so we started to think really about, here's a story of Jews, the ghetto being brought to Jews rather than the Jews being brought to the ghetto. But the other thing that became interesting, and I think this is something that I was reflecting upon in Todd and Rachel, your own work as well, in Ethics of the Algorithm, which is to think about digital mapping as process rather than output. So in a sense, thinking about digital mapping as a kind of research tool that we use to prompt new questions. Like, one thing that was interesting as we started to map out the dispersed ghetto was we started to think, like, did distance play any role? You know, if people are living all over the city, like, did it matter where you lived? What about physical distance? Does physical distance mean that you have different degrees of access to either other people or particular resources? So one of the things that we just started to do, and in a sense this is a map that I only show as a kind of process map, which was just to say just actually where are the most isolated residences? Like, in a sense, where are the residences where if you lived there as a Jewish family in 1944, you were the furthest away from other families? Critical in a city where there's a curfew, where Jews can only leave their homes for a certain period of time in the afternoon. And so, in a sense, who could you not get to? Who could you not visit within the city? Were there a set of invisible walls that started to be created within the city as a result of physical distance operating? And most interesting to us was to start thinking about, actually, what are the kinds of things that people wanted to get access to during this period? What happens if you start mapping out where the market halls are or where the Jewish hospitals are? And in this case, what happens if you start mapping out the Swedish legation buildings? So in 1944 in Budapest, there's a guy called Raoul Wallenberg, who's a Swedish diplomat who's issuing protective paperwork to Jews, along with the Swiss are also doing this, Spanish, Portuguese, Vatican. So there's a whole series of neutral legations that are doing this. And here you see just the mapping of the two legation buildings. One on the Buda side of the river. Interestingly, they open a new office on the Pest side of the river, in large part because of the proximity of Jews to that office. And what you can see there is we've just mapped out literally half-hour, 1 hour walking distances to that, to think about who is furthest from those particular buildings within the city. What I think is interesting about these kinds of mapping is that these kinds of maps are very much hypothetical models, which I think are best rendered as kinds of think pieces, because we don't know if people used the least cost route. I mean, essentially what we've mapped there, isn't it, is we've mapped a sense that assumes that if you want to get there, you get there quickly. And so what we've mapped is the least cost route. And yet the reality is, of course, that there's lots of different ways of getting there. And this is where one of the things that I think has been really interesting in working with digital humanities mapping is to think about how can mapping provoke new questions that take us back to the archive to ask new things of the archive that we didn't see the first time round, or are the questions that we hadn't ever asked. And so just give one example of that from an archive based in Sweden with survivors who were rescued by Wallenberg and the Swedish legation. What I think is fascinating is they're going back to that archive with that map in your mind. Suddenly we start to see things, and we're like, actually that's really interesting. Like, what were the strategies that people deployed to beat a set of invisible walls that were created within this dispersed ghetto? One of the critical strategies was that non-Jewish neighbours became suddenly massively important, because non-Jewish neighbours didn't have the curfew applied to them. And suddenly we then, in a sense, kind of started to reimagine what was happening. There's this really kind of odd little line right at the end of a piece of government legislation in June 44, which says that non-Jewish neighbours can continue living in these Jewish houses. And so you've got this very unusual ghetto in Budapest where it's not only dispersed across the city, but it's actually could be that a Jewish family is living next door to a non-Jewish family in a Jewish designated building. And suddenly those people become incredibly important, like critical players. And it really matters if that's been your apartment before the war and you've built up 20 years of shared experience with that neighbour. And so suddenly we're starting to ask a set of questions about non-Jewish neighbours and actually starting to imagine ghettoisation in Budapest as not so much bringing Jews together, but separating Jews out and bringing Jews and non-Jews together in new kinds of sets of social relations that could be critical to surmount physical distance within this city. But the other thing we started to do was we started to work with another set of sources. We don't have most of the sources of protective paperwork survive. What we do have is a list of 7,000 Jews who were given Swedish protective paperwork. And so what we did with that list was we started to map out who those Jews were. And what you find here is this is the centre of gravity of that particular Jewish community, so the Jewish community on that list, compared to the centre of gravity of all Jews in 1941 and the centre of gravity of the Budapest population in that period. I think what's interesting is that you see that in 1941, which is when there's the last census, that in a sense the Jewish population more or less represented the non-Jewish population as well, that there's a commonality, that essentially Jews and non-Jews live kind of in the same places, that they live largely in these large central districts, and that if you think about where they are, so if you think of the green circle and the pink square, essentially the centre of gravity of Jewish and non-Jewish life is essentially in the same place, that it mirrors, the Jewish residential patterns more or less mirror non-Jewish residential patterns. But we've got this outlier, which is that this list looks really different. So it just doesn't look the same as that. And what's really striking for us is that this list and the centre of gravity of the lists isn't anywhere near physically where the Swedish legation is. Like the Swedish legation buildings lie far to the south of that. They're close to the Jewish community that lives in the 8th district, rather than the Jewish community that lives up in the 5th district or the 6th district. There's a different geography at play here. It's a different geography. It's not topography, it's much more topology. And it's much more around socioeconomics. In Budapest at this time, you've got two very different Jewish communities living in the 8th and the 5th district. In the 8th district, a Jewish community that's much poorer and often much more religious, in particular much more associated with orthodoxy. In the 5th district, a Jewish community that's much more assimilated and much wealthier. And what you start to get is a different kind of geography here of Swedish protection, which is a geography really of economics and social economics. That the Jews on that list are not representative of the Jews of the city, but they're the Jews who are from the wealthiest part of the city. And interestingly for us, that's where the international ghetto is placed in the, December and January 45. So it's a case again of the ghetto being brought to the Jews, but a very particular ghetto. In a sense, what you get in 45 is that two different ghettos are created. One, in a sense, for wealthier Jews, and one for poorer Jews, that reflects this kind of geography. Just moving on to sense of place, this kind of trickier thing to map, and this is where we've kind of shifted increasingly, I think, is to think about, actually, how do we start to map the subjective experiences of space and place, in particular of victims and survivors. And this was really kicked off by work by Simone Gigliotti and Eric Steiner, amongst others. That I think is one of my favourite parts of the 2014 volume. They started by trying to think about how you map the evacuations from Auschwitz in January 1945. So 27th of January we just had was the liberation of Auschwitz. A couple of weeks before, Nazi Germany evacuates its prisoner population westwards into the camps that still exist in the West, in particular in Germany. And one of the things they started to do was just to kind of start mapping out those routes. And I think there's a value to a map like this. It's essentially a fairly traditional locational map, which shows which routes were taken by prisoners on the 17th, 18th and 19th of January, and critically which routes the SS planned to take people on, in green at the top, where the plan and the reality don't quite mesh, as you often find within authoritarian states. But I think what became more interesting to us was the way that actually they started to try and map survivor testimony. So they took testimony of Polish prisoners and literally placed it onto the map. So where does someone talk about and someone not talk about? So this is a woman who's evacuated out of Auschwitz, and if you see, there's a camp at the top, and then this is the place where they get onto a train 60 kilometres hence, 40 miles away, down at the bottom. And it was literally a case of taking the testimony, the post-war testimony of a whole series of Polish prisoners, and placing them onto the map. And this is Eric's brilliant cartography, I think, where every single letter from every single word of testimony is placed onto the map of that group of Polish political women. And what you start to see is you start to see silences, you see presences and absences. And I think that's something that I'll finish off by saying, because I think that's something that we've become really interested in. And again, I think this meshes with your own work, Todd and Rachel, is that digital humanities, in a sense, I think for me is interesting because it can accentuate the silences rather than cover them up. Or maybe a responsible digital humanities brings the silences to the fore rather than kinds of erases them. And I think this work was really suggestive in pointing to the potential of visualising silence in a testimonial record as well as presence. And it's a kind of topographical silence, isn't it? Because it's like literally where do these women not talk about on this route? And that's something that a lot of us have been working on. Anne has been doing some really interesting work with Levi Westerveld, thinking about how you map survivor testimony. And Alberto and I have been starting to do that as well. And in a sense, this is just a little bit of our kind of process that I think a lot of our mapping starts in very analog terms. So before we start using digital renderings, in a sense, we start using, I think, visualization as a kind of way of thinking. And I often talk about this with my PhD students, that I think maybe, again, this is one of the skill sets that we don't often have within humanities training, is a kind of way of thinking visually, or a sense of using something other than text as a way of trying to think through our problems and to try and think through the archive. And what we did, Alberto and I, was literally just sat down and started to watch VHA testimony and start to draw as we watched. Anne talks about this as inductive visualization, as a kind of methodology that I think is a really fruitful and productive methodology. The thing we were really interested in doing was to start to think about, is there a way that we could start rendering location, locale and sense of place on one map in almost a kind of graphic novel type method. This is just showing one Jewish boy's story. What I have is just one place, so it's one of these ghetto houses in Budapest, which you can see the location of in red on the top map. You can see a little bit of the locale of how many apartments there are and how many Jews are in each apartment. Most critically, I think you can see the social networks, like who else is in the apartment with this particular boy. And then from the narrative, from both what he says and how he says it, what are some of the dominant emotions that emerge within this place? Like, is there a way in which we can start to introduce emotional landscapes into the map? And what I think is really striking is that as an individual starts to move from location to location, what you find is both continuities and changes in the sense of emotional landscapes that particularly reflect who is present. And in particular, the kind of complexity of emotions. For this boy, there's a period of sorrow because his father is not present. And I'll say a tiny bit more about that in a minute. But there's also a period of joy because this is where he has what he describes as his first sweetheart, who's another Jewish girl who's living in this ghetto house. Or as he moves to one of the protected buildings, suddenly what he finds there is a cousin who joins them in this building, a cousin who's a doctor, and he latches onto this older cousin and follows him around the building, and ultimately himself becomes a doctor later in life. And this is kind of this pivotal moment where this one man becomes a kind of heroic figure in his narrative. And so as well as fear, there's also a sense of kind of joy that's revealed. And we've just started to experiment with this. Yeah.
In looking at the emotional component and content, is this derived from journals or where is this?
This is from the testimony. So this is derived from the testimony. So it's a mixture of both what is said in the testimony, but also how it's said. So we're trying to work with the two kind of levels. This is all kind of like careful, close reading, close listening, close watching. And it's using a kind of dominant set. I mean, there's a whole range of ways you can think about emotions. We're just using a dominant set of emotions as a way of kind of rendering in some ways the emotional landscape of these sites. And I think what we're particularly interested in doing is thinking about how can you create a kind of new set of maps that maybe are more akin to the multiple boxes of a graphic novel, that are a different way of thinking about a survivor's trajectory, and in particular, the narrative that's offered of a survivor's trajectory. So the stories that someone tells about their movement through space, and the locational dimension, I think, still remains important to us. But actually what's richer is the sense of a kind of shifting set of emotional relationships and subjective experiences of those particular places and times. Just final thing in terms of mapping sense of place, and then I'll kind of move to think a bit broader in closing about digital humanities, is one thing we've been interested in doing more recently as well, is thinking about what does home mean in post-Holocaust contexts, in particular in European cities where home is in a sense destroyed or kind of forever changed. And here we're working with a really interesting source. It's a register of Jewish survivors that's created by the American Joint and World Jewish Council in 1945, published in 46. Essentially what they do in 45 is they send young volunteers around the city to literally knock on every door and say, "Are you Jewish?" As you can imagine, not everyone says yes. This is like July 45. But 70,000 people do say yes. And then what they do is they collect the information geographically, and then they render it alphabetically, in large part so that it can then be, for example, in New York, a copy of this could be in New York. So you can look through the list in New York and find out if your auntie and uncle are still alive or not alive, and if they are alive, where they're living. So it's an extraordinary census created through this process in 1945, which gives us a little glimpse of who is alive and also declares themselves Jewish within this city. This is just a kind of age breakdown, female in blue, male in orange there. You can see it's a predominantly female population. Interestingly, I think in Budapest you've got quite a lot of child survivors over on the left, and actually a relatively large number of older survivors. Like, it's very unusual demographic breakdown. If you think of 60 to 69-year-olds and 70 to 79-year-olds, in a sense that's the missing generation, isn't it, across Europe? But in Budapest, for geopolitical reasons, you've got very large numbers of survivors. It gives us birthplace and birth year, and this is, I always think this is kind of interesting. I love these kind of visuals. Maybe I'm seduced by the visual, but I think there's something interesting when you just do it, which is like, oh my gosh, look at that pattern. It totally fits with what we know about Jewish immigration, internal migration within cities in Europe in this period, which is that in red, most Jews born before 1901, were born outside Budapest, and then it switches in 1901. You got this switch where actually most Jews have been born in Budapest. Look at that extraordinary demographic dip in the time of the First World War. In this city. I show you that because of this. Like what we were interested in doing was we got all this data, like what can you do with the data? One thing we were really interested in doing was in some ways creating a way where we could use algorithms and in particular scripts written in R to extract kinship patterns in a post-war city in a simplified way. And so what we decided to do was we decided to work with a binary of born in Budapest and not born in Budapest, because it was a binary that made historiographical sense and also we knew made some sense here. And so what you see is if you look at the top left, born in Budapest on the left, not born in Budapest on the right. This is the date of birth up on the left-hand column. And then what we have is women red, male in blue. And so what you have on the top left is in a sense a kind of classic nuclear family that survives the Holocaust in Budapest. So a woman born in Budapest in 1896, a man not born in Budapest in 1897, and then 3 daughters born in Budapest broadly in the 1930s. And then what we could do is we could start to extract from that to start to repopulate the city. So I just give you here one street and one house. So this is Miaruca 19 in the 7th district of the city. Can you see our family there on the middle right? So this is our nuclear family. I mean, it's not a surprise that the Holocaust is the destruction of the traditional nuclear family. And the creation, I think, of all sorts of really interesting other kinship groups in post-Holocaust city, and this is some of the work we're doing at the moment, is trying to think about like what's the nature of new Jewish kinship groups that are created post-Holocaust. And what's striking, I think, is in the top middle, you see a very common form, which is sibling kinship groups that are created in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And then on the left hand, the 3 boxes here on the left, these are 3 family units that are all connected. You get these extraordinarily interesting, multi-generational, complex kinship groups that are created in and through space within these cities, as well as a very large number of single people who appear isolated. This is just a couple of doors down the street, Miaruca 11. And so this is some of the work we're doing at the moment, is thinking about how can we take this extraordinarily large census and through a set of automated processes start to try and recreate Jewish family patterns, Jewish kinship patterns within the city, and start to think critically about different streets. Like, what's the nature of streets? Are there certain streets where mainly widows are living? Are there streets that have very different kinds of Jewish communities being created, and what's the relationship between those and pre-war Jewish life? This is stuff we haven't yet published on, so it's just the stuff that we're working on at the moment. What we have got coming out is a piece of work that I find particularly interesting, because I'm quite interested in the way that digital humanities methods might allow us to read against the grain of the archive and to kind of dig into the absences in a way that actually reveals something from them. And I just give this one example from a piece of work that we've got coming out, Alberto and I, which is to think about the gendering of survival in Budapest, and in particular the nature of gendered life and death in the post-war city. Now, we're helped in this context by the peculiarities of the Hungarian language. And I think this is one of the places where I think Joanna Drucker's work is so important, where she reminds us that as digital humanists we work with capta, not data. The things that we work with, the sources we work with, are sources that are historically and geographically constituted, and also linguistically and socio and culturally constituted. Without boring you with too much detail, in Hungarian, if you marry, you take on your husband's name in its entirety. So in this case, they give an example. The editors are so bemused by this, because I think this is largely a book that's created for American Jews, and they think they won't understand what this is all about. They explain that if Laszlo Einzig gets married, then his wife literally becomes Einzig Laszlo Ney, the wife of Laszlo Einzig. and she loses her entire, not just her second family name, but also her first name. In some ways, she takes on her husband's first name. And then behind that, what you'll see is her maiden name, so Berg Blanca in full. And so every woman within in our list who's married has the full name of her husband, as the wife, nay, using the suffix nay, and then the maiden name. Now, what's particularly important for that is it allows us to start using a set of automated methods to write a script which starts to extract family relations from a list where those family relations have been split up because it's alphabetized. And so we can start to put people back together in kinship groups, and we can start to put them back together in place. And what is particularly significant for us is that it suddenly starts to reveal what is a blank space in this name list, which is the critical thing is the women with ghost husbands, bottom line, city, 12,893. What the script suggests is that within this city, there's close to 13,000 women who don't know if their husband is alive or dead, who are living in what you'd see as a state of ambiguous loss. So that most women in this city who are married do not yet know if their husband is alive or dead in the summer of 1945. Those who are living with their husband is just over 10,000. Those who are widowed is 7,000. In Hungarian, you keep your husband's name but have a prefix as widow attached at the beginning. And so the linguistic specificity of this capture allows us to start to point to the existence of something which isn't there in the archive, but can be in some ways read if we read against the grain using digital methods. And I think what's striking about this is it suddenly points to the normality of ambiguous loss in the post-war period as a dominant experience for women in this city. The nature of Hungarian means we can't do this for men, because whether a man is married or not is never revealed through the captor, through the data. We can only do this for women. But for women, where we can do this, we can point to the incredible significance of a group of people who are somewhere between survivor and victim, who are living in this kind of ambiguous state, who are men who have not yet returned. And again, I think what that does is it draws us back to the archive to ask a new set of questions. This is, again, from VHA archive. I was really struck by this interview, a kid called George Mock, who talks about how, he talks really interestingly about being kind of drawn to a particular microgeography of the apartment building, which was the front door, the front gate of the apartment building. And he reflects, I think the reason I went to the front gate so often was because I was expecting my dad to knock on the front gate and to come home. And in his case, the father never does come home. For years, they live in a state of ambiguous loss. I think what the digital humanities methods, that kind of distant reading, suggests is how dominant that is. In a sense, here we have a single story, and there's many other stories that you find within the oral history archive. But the digital humanities methods of distant reading allow us to, in a sense, position and place this within the much broader context, and to suggest that this is a kind of normal experience of both women and also their children, Jewish women and Jewish children living in the city in that place. Let me finish with this. This is work that I really like. It's by Hannah Pollen-Galley. She's written a really brilliant book on, super interesting actually, on how different stories are told in different places. Lithuania, United States, America, forensic in Lithuania, Zionist in Israel, and much more in the American context, kind of like about there has to be some meaning from the Holocaust. So you get these very different narratives. She writes this really interesting essay, I think, where she's critical of the VHA mapping interface, because she says it renders to perfect what is a much more troubled story. That it's one of those moments where digital humanities, in a sense, just kind of smooths out all of the wrinkles and suggests a kind of perfect story. And in particular, she points to this survivor, Golani, being taken to Stutthof and describing it as a no place. And she says, how do you render a no place? You don't render a no place with a dot on Google Maps. You need to grapple with a no place in a different kind of way. And I think that, to me, is really important about digital humanities. I think this is where I see a lot of commonalities with our work, Todd and Rachel, that we've been doing, is really to think about actually the silences and the gaps and the messiness and the complexity is really, really important. And that actually maybe that's the kind of ethical and historiographical digital humanities, is one that really draws that to the fore and reveals that. And I think particularly works with that idea of captor, a digital humanities that really engages seriously with notions of captor and deals with the kinds of nature of the sources. Just finish with this. You know, one thing that I've been interested in, this is work that I'm doing with Eric Steiner at the moment, is to think about the use of pauses within survivor narratives. So this is just 1,000 random interviews from the VHA archive. And what we've done there is we've just rendered every pause in rank order, from the person who pauses the most at the top to the person who pauses the least at the bottom. So that's 1,000 interviews. What's striking about that guy at the bottom is it's not him who pauses, it's the interviewer who pauses, because he's so amazingly sophisticated and brilliant in his delivery that he throws the interviewer off. And the interviewer's like, runs out of questions. And so you've got this sense of someone who has mastered the narrative to someone who hasn't mastered the narrative, or interestingly, has mastered bits of the narrative. And I think this to me is really one of the things that I think is really critical in digital humanities and mapping, is that how do we really engage deeply with the nature of the sources, that we don't just render an oral history as a transcript, as a series of words, but we grapple with the orality of it, and that we use DH methods to really bring the orality to the fore, or we use digital methods to take seriously the possibilities, like I showed with the ghost husbands, that lie within grappling with the fact that another language, might enable us to unearth something that wouldn't be possible within a language like English, that using different languages within DH, a kind of transcultural DH, is really one way that we can start to tell a whole series of different stories. And I think crucially, I guess for us in mapping, you know, and I really think Hannah's work is important there, is to think about how can we do mapping that really that grapples with the nature of the sources and that brings the kind of gaps and the absences and the missing places to the fore, and does something that's much more than just putting a dot on a map location, but really tries to grapple with ideas of locale and sense of place. Thank you for your patience.
That was just so great, Tim. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I will open up to questions, although I have plenty, and also plenty of reactions. But thank you so much for your generosity and really overview of this work. Let's see if there's questions first from the audience, or reactions or anything. Please.
Thank you so much for this. I really admire your work very much, and I kind of want to bounce off this kind of closing point that you have, like grapple with the orality of it. I'm a musicologist, and I actually work on voice and testimony and some of virtual reality stuff. And I'm just kind of curious, because you mentioned that most of this data is from the VHA archives, and so many of the survivor testimonies can also be found in different versions. And you mentioned that silence was actually from the interviewer rather than the survivor. And sometimes what I found in comparing at different points, like maybe there's like a testimony on YouTube where the affective quality of their voice is completely different than it is in VHA. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you've ever thought about like comparing these different variants of times in their lives when they're actually telling the exact same story, but at different periods in their lives, you know, their voice is older, the silences are different. Yeah. If you've thought.
Todd has. So he's the. Because ethics of the algorithm. There's a little bit of work, isn't there, done? There's that book that Tina Grossman and Jürgen Matthäus and people contribute, which is where they took a series of the Boda interviews. There's one woman, isn't there? They follow Wendy Lau's got an essay in it. There's a whole series of interviews with one woman, and they think they're about the kind of persistence of a narrative. But I think that is something that we do want to try and think about, is to think more, as Todd and colleagues have done, which is about that sense of what's the shifting orality. And I think for me, the thing I'm really interested in there is there's a sense, the work of Alessandro Portelli I really admire in oral history, in narrative studies. And Portelli talks about how that there's certain things about the orality that can't be found by reading, but demand a kind of close listening. But I am really interested in distant listening, and I think this is like very much ties to your work, Todd and colleagues, in distant witnessing, is that I actually think, to me, this is one of the kind of real challenges is for us, is to think about digital humanities as a set of tools or methods or approaches or ways of working or ways of visualizing data that we can apply multiple methods depending on what's the nature of the sources and what's the nature of the questions we're asking. And that we also recognize the limits of them. Like we kind of work out what they're good for doing and what, I guess, in Todd, your work, you kind of also think much more deeply about the ethics of that as well. And what we realize they're not good for doing. And I think, like Todd and colleagues, I'm really interested in that sense of switching and toggling between distant and close, reading and listening. But I think there is something really interesting about distant listening to an entire archive, which is to say, actually, I think interestingly here, the Shoah Foundation, often is criticized for essentially telling the same story 54,000 times over. Whereas I actually think it's told, actually people tell the story really differently, from those who tell it in a very fragmented, broken way, to those who tell it in a way that's supremely practiced and where they're in total control of the material all the way through. And so I think that this is a very different rendering of the Shoah Foundation, isn't it? Which says actually it's a much more diverse archive than we might imagine.
It's a kind of counter-indexing of the archive.
Yeah,
too.
it is.
You think of the very literalist way that the Shoah Foundation indexed these testimonies. Usually, it's mostly places mentioned, people, and some historical events. But and they have marked up in the transcript the pauses. It's like one could begin to quantify it, but beyond that, nothing.
Yeah.
And so it's like this distance, a kind of rendering of the archive like this. Also, that impels us to really zoom in and go, okay, what was going on at this particular site?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Was it a code switching across language? You can't forget too that sometimes it is just a technical question, but sometimes it's really about language and language choice and the nature of the question that's being asked and the dynamic between the interviewer and even questions of body, performance, and gesture are really important here. So I love the idea of kind of thinking distance listening is also empowering us to do really close listening, and close listening is a multiple thing. You do it more than once.
Yeah, and I think to me that's one of the things that's really interesting about DH work, isn't it? Is that I guess maybe someone who's kind of opposed to DH thinks it's just like setting a computer on something. That I think it really draws our attention to a kind of close reading in a way that we wouldn't normally do, and it maybe draws our attention. I think you wrote about this, Todd, to maybe an interview we wouldn't necessarily watch or listen to. That suddenly we're like, we really want to listen to this interview here because we want to know what happens at that point where they suddenly become really lucid. Apparently, like what are they talking about? Like I think that's the thing that to me is really interesting about DH as a kind of a part of our methods as humanists. That it's not the only thing we do, but it's the thing that we do that helps us to ask new questions or to focus in in new ways in close reading, close listening. But yeah, it's a great project. But have a look at read Todd's book if you haven't read it, because they have a chapter where they talk about that, and it's good. Rachel.
Very strong risk of making more of a comment than a question.
That's fine. Comments are good.
Your chapter about Budapest not being in the Holocaust Geographies book I've taught many times in students, especially the animation on this.
Yeah.
I don't know if it still works, but I found that my students were always really intrigued by this idea of when you look at a map, you don't really think about how long does it take to get from one place to the next, and then thinking about that hour-long window and what can you do in that hour and how far can you get was really profound for kind of thinking about the experiences and then going back to the testimony to rethink about those. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how all of these methods in this work has shaped your teaching and how you think about the difference between the scholarly conversations that you're having and the kind of work you do as a teacher.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, one thing that's interesting about that work, and a lot of that came from Alberto, if I'm honest there, because Alberto said to me, Tim, we've got to have a layer which has got the street on it. And I was like, why do we need the street layer? Surely. And it's going to take forever to do that. And he's like, no, believe me, we really need this. And I was like, okay, Alberto, we'll put the street layer on. And then he said, look, if we got the street layer on, we can start to see where people could walk. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about that. I'd never, ever thought that could be an interesting question. And I think for me, what I guess is useful, and I think this has been working increasingly with geographers. I mean, in the end, my undergrad was history. I then did a PhD in geography, but I teach, now mainly history. Although I guess a lot of my work's quite geographical in some ways. But I think geographers sometimes bring concepts to the fore that are really useful for us to work with students, like proximity and distance. Like, it's a very simple geographical concept, isn't it? That I think is really useful to use with students at everything from the continental scale through to like urban scale. Like if I'm teaching kind of urban history, like suddenly proximity and distance becomes a really important question as just a kind of framing, as a way of thinking. And so I think what are the things that I thought about absence and presence, or just, those kinds of big geographical concepts I think have been really useful to bring into teaching as a way of framing things. I think the other thing that I've been doing a lot is just getting students to draw maps, not using ArcGIS, which takes a while to get handy with, but just using tracing paper. So Anne's a big fan of this. And if you use 3 sheets of tracing paper, you can create a layered map, can't you, just with paper that in ArcGIS might take you, like months to perfect. And I think, to me, that's a really useful skill for students, is to be like thinking, oh, actually, what would happen if I just started to draw this thing that I'm working on and started to put it onto a series of base maps? And it doesn't have to look beautiful, but it's just helping you to think about what's the spatial relationships. And like, oh, what happens if I overlay it with this? Like, what's the nature of the spatial relationships now, or if I overlay it with that? And so that's one thing that I've been doing. And I think that is interesting to me, is how maybe sometimes the digital humanities isn't about, like, obviously the technology is useful, but actually I think a lot of it's about a way of working, or a way of thinking. It's like visualizing archives or thinking about relationships that maybe sometimes you use non-textual methods to do. And I thought that was interesting, actually, in your book. There's a really interesting bit in the book where you guys use like a set of what could be more algorithmic methods to do an incredibly close listening and reading of just a tiny fragment. And I thought it was an interesting moment where I feel like, oh, that's interesting. You're thinking like a digital humanist, but you're actually bringing that to the least digital thing, which is close reading. And I think that's the thing maybe that I've been trying to do in my teaching a little bit, is like, what are the ways that digital humanists think, and actually how can you apply that in a much more focused way to help you in more traditional archival work as historians, because the students I teach are all history majors rather than being geographers. So I'm kind of trying to bring a little bit of those ways of thinking to the fore. But it was Alberto who really insisted on a street network, and I'm so glad he did, because it meant that we asked a bunch of questions we'd never have asked. And I genuinely saw stuff in the archive I'd never seen before, because I just hadn't thought to ask. Like, did distance matter? Didn't cross my mind first time I went through the archive. And then it was there everywhere, once you start looking for it.
I have a sort of, in a way, kind of related and follow-up question to that, which is, I'm very curious the impact of teaching. I'm on faculty here, also working my way through a PhD myself, and I'm thinking quite a bit, because my field is also music and biographical, how my own studies and scholarship and project is going to manifest, and how with this type of work, it is pretty mind-blowing for me and what I'm delving into, what that might mean for an end result, as opposed to the sort of, okay, what scholarship, here's my book.
Yeah.
But having these, this oral actually is a big part of it, visual and the music component, what that might mean for an end result. So I'm curious what you've seen maybe with your students and your own work, how things have changed in terms of an end product and the different types of work that is coming out of it that's new in this digital age.
Yeah, that's a great question, I think. Like, in some ways things have changed, but maybe not as much as they should or could, if I'm honest. Because I think, like, the academy is weirdly conservative, I'd say. Like maybe people don't perceive it that way from the outside, but I think inside the academy it's like an oddly conservative space. Like PhDs are actually weirdly conservative still, aren't they, in humanities? Like you do it on your own as a lone scholar, you write 80,000 words or 300 pages or whatever it is. Like there's something odd about that. I mean, it feels quite 19th century, in all honesty. I think, the academy still is probably tied up with a lot of 19th century ways of working that are, frankly, probably kind of irrelevant for the 21st century. And I think that's what we probably need is much more, kind of a switch in the ways that we work and a kind of reimagining of what, graduate training could be and the ways that we might work. And I think, I guess there's a danger of saying, like, we follow the STEM model, like if humanities wants to survive, it's got to follow the STEM model. I believe in the humanities, massively. But I think there is something in some of the STEM model that's quite interesting and useful about rapid publication, about lab models, about ways of working, about co-authorship. There's a long and tested way of getting a PhD in the sciences that is working in a lab model with co-authorship, isn't there? That it's not like it's impossible to give a PhD apart from the kinds of models we have within the humanities. I think there's real, kind of ways of working. I think that one thing, like maybe I'd say two things that are almost kind of contradictory. Like the first thing is that I've shown you lots of images, and I'm sure this is probably true for you, Todd, that what finds its way into print is just a fraction of all of the images we produce, because most of the images are actually thinking through visualization. And that to me is really important about DH work, is that it's actually about visualizing for process rather than for output. And so a lot of the work is just rough and ready kind of sketches, and it's just trying things out, and it's exploratory. And so in some ways I think that for me would be one of the really key things, is like in whatever project I'm doing, even if the final output is a textual output, in what way could I use visualization methods, a range of visualization tools as a way of just kind of playing with the stuff. And this is just using Tableau, which is a very readily available software. First thing is AntConc, which is also very, a lot of this stuff is free, it's easy to access, it's very easy to use. And I think for me, that's been one of the real things that I thought a lot about, or try and have my students think about, is like, actually, here's a set of tools. Could you just start using some of those tools to think about your textual data in a different way? So that you just visualize it in some ways, you ask questions of it, and you might never issue those in the final paper, but actually they've really helped you to get to the kind of stage of analysis and raising questions. And so I think in one way I'd say, like, don't publish the visuals, but they're actually, maybe show them at a talk like this, which is more about methods, but actually it's kind of, maybe they're sometimes useful to show as a method, but not to kind of obsess about them, because in some ways I think they're more useful as just a way of thinking and a process. I think the other side of it is more that I think the visuals can be incredibly useful in teaching or helping people to see history in a different kind of way. And so I think some of the interfaces we've tried to create, I think maybe have been useful there. So in particular, some of the animations, like Anne and her team created this amazing animation of the opening and closing of the camp system, and they're doing the same for the ghettos. And I think it's incredible because it's so brilliant to use in teaching with students, which is, as a student, like you think, you ask your students, when do you think most camps were created by the Nazis? And they're like, I don't know, maybe 1930s, and you're like, okay, or like maybe 42. And then you run the animation, and you're like, it's 44. It's like right at the end of the war, the thing that the Nazis are doing is creating a vast network of labour camps. Why are they doing that? It's because there's a switch in policy, it's because of the nature of the war. It's suddenly something which is a visual that's incredibly useful just for helping students think about the camp system, and as a way in to then ask much bigger questions about the nature of ideology and economics within Nazism, and to kind of link in with a set of readings, about Nazi political economy. But it's a kind of way of getting like students just seeing something. And so I think that, to me, that's one of the things that I have thought about, is like, what are the visuals we can create that are really useful in a classroom context or in a more public-facing context? So, within museums, like what are the visuals within museums that really help you to see the Holocaust in a different way? Anne actually has just created some really amazing maps she showed me, which are going to be in the UN in New York. So the UN in New York is doing something like a really interesting exhibition. And Anne's created these extraordinary maps that really, I think, help you to re-see Central Europe during the Holocaust. And they're huge, and they'll be on the wall there, and they're just amazing, I think. And just, as someone who's a specialist, I look at them, I'm like, oh, that just helps me to kind of visualize things, the stuff I'm interested in a different way, I'll contextualize it. And so I think there is a real value to visualization as just a way, of helping people to see things different. I mean, to me, I think this kind of visualization might be really useful for the VHA as an interface, which is just like, maybe I want to index search where people pause, or who's got the most fragmented narrative, or whatever. Like, it's just different access points. And some of the visuals that Todd has in the book as well, the same. I think to me they'd be a really interesting interface, which is like, how can you help someone to ask new questions? I guess that's where they come together, isn't it? That in some ways, I guess we're always interested in asking questions. That's teaching, isn't it? Like, we don't tell our students anything, we just help them to ask new questions. And that's what I think is interesting about visualization. Is visualization helps me ask new questions. It helps my students ask new questions. It helps members of the public ask new questions. Like critical thinking. Like, that's what we need in the world, isn't it? It's critical thinkers. Maybe this can help.
You mentioned the museum thing. I don't know if anyone else saw the Autry had an exhibit, The History of Jews in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And did you see that, the map that they had it was a flat, huge map of the United States, and it was interactive.
Mm-hmm.
And they had colored thread. And you went up and you tied the thread off where you came from, like where you were born, and you traced, and it could be Europe, it was like off the map. And you put the thread across the United States, and a lot of people had done it, so there was just like this series of threads and networks, and you could see the migration, you could see, East Coast to West Coast. It was a really kind of fascinating visual, and see the colors people picked, but also where people traveled. It was really interesting.
I mean, visuals are a really important part of our life, aren't they? Like, it's dumb of us not to use them. I mean, many of us think visually, I think, don't we? We connect with data visually, or places. I mean, maps are kind of intriguing, aren't they? As a way of just thinking about the world, our relationship in the world.
Kind of going off of that, one thing that I was thinking about in your talk is, there's like the goal of the map in a lot of ways is to make something clear or help someone navigate something, but you're also dealing with these archives and information that is very, contradictory or complex. And you're talking about making, layered maps. I feel like you could theoretically make a map that makes things much harder to understand or much more complicated and confusing. And I'm just curious about that tension there of wanting to make something more clear to someone while also being true to those inconsistencies and wanting to cram in a maximum amount of information. But doing that might be kind of counter to your goal of making something that visually is like, oh, okay, I'm making connections here. So just if you could speak on that process.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's like a brilliant question, because maps are always about abstraction, aren't they? Because otherwise we would create, as the kind of myth tells, that like a map of Los Angeles would have to be exactly the same scale as Los Angeles, wouldn't it? I mean, the city's already here. Like, any map of Los Angeles is by definition a simplification and abstraction of the complexity of Los Angeles. And I think that's one thing that interests me about mapping. I mean, that's where maps are, have a power, don't they? That maps are never neutral objects. Because my simplification of Los Angeles would be different from yours. Like, what's relevant to include? Like, how do we imagine the city and render the city? Cartography always has ideology and has, it's a point of view, quite literally, isn't it? I think for us, one thing that's important is like we probably talk a bit too much about method in everything we write, but that's really important because we want to reveal that, because we want to say this map is not a perfect rendering and a kind of a kind of objective truth. This is a rendering, and we've made a whole set of decisions, and we've decided to shade this in this color and that. Like, legend matters in maps, doesn't it? Like color, all of those kinds of things are really important. And so I think that feels really important to me, is laying bare the nature of the abstraction, so that you've made a set of conscious choices and you articulate what those conscious choices are. But I think some abstraction is really important, because I think abstraction enables the thing that I think is maybe the ultimate goal is when we're making a map, we want to try and understand the world as a result of making a map. Like that's where it's, I mean, I guess that is about finding our way in some ways in a more kind of meta level, isn't it? Like we're trying to find ourselves in the world, or we're trying to like work out, like in my case, historical stuff. We're trying to understand the Holocaust and the nature of Jewish life in Holocaust and post-Holocaust Europe. Like the map is a way to do that, and so there needs to be some kind of abstraction that allows us to do some comparative and analytical work. But an abstraction that also allows the gaps to be visible and the messiness of the archive to be visible and the kind of limits of the archive and the fuzziness of the archive. And that's one thing that we're really interested in working on. Anne's done some interesting work on that, where when she's mapped survivor testimony, you often find this, if you look at survivor testimony, there's moments of kind of certainty, like Hannah Pollingallo says, but there's a lot of stuff that's less certain. And what Anna's been doing is mapping that in topological relationship to the places of certainty. So here's my hometown, we have a little bit of certainty, but here's a bunch of places I talk about, like a barn, like a field, a forest. We don't know where that is, like it might be north, south, east or west. We know it's kind of in the imaginary, in the geographical imaginary, it's connected by that survivor to that town. And so that's a kind of more fuzzy set of relations that are drawn. And I think that's what's interesting to me, is the kinds of ways in which cartographers can work in more kind of creative ways. And that's where I think working with smart cartographers is great. And also I think looking at the work of artists, you know, I think if you think of artists, there's so much brilliant work by artists that includes mapping or thinking about mapping. And I think it's really inspiring for us as historians to reach into the visual arts and think about what are the ways we can render maps and reimagine maps. And in a sense, I think everything I've shown you is maps, but none of them have looked the same. Like, they're all maps of a sort, because they all have some kind of geographic data to them. Like, they all have spatiotemporal data, but they kind of imagine those relationships in different ways. And I think that's been really interesting, is working, you know, particularly with Eric Steiner. Now, I think Eric's a brilliant cartographer, a really creative cartographer and artist. And I think he really helps you to imagine the map differently. That every map is an abstraction, being honest about the abstraction, but that actually the kind of visual repertoire you have for mapping is really diverse, and I love that about maps. I think I'm just a failed artist who ended up as an academic. I couldn't do anything else. Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for your work. It's so important to have, just in terms of preservation. And on the note of visual artists, yesterday we just taught in a data justice and society class the work of Mimi Ona. I don't know if you know her work.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
And your work resonates with us a lot in terms of this attention to the silences and the pauses.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, how your archive could also be in conversation with trauma studies, like trauma studies emerged from Holocaust. In the sense of the affect, you know, the emotions of what transpired, be registered as a memory, the horror. You know, not to reproduce it on a visual level, but on the sense of PTSD or picking up the literature. And I really liked your map, which allowed us to look at the text. And then look at the text as well. So, but the emotions kind of as that. You know. Because one thing Mimi Onoha said, you were just saying the same thing, which is she's not interested so much in the final data visualization as the ethics of the process. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about those.
I mean, I think that's a really great question, because I think it resonates so much. Like, I think at a bigger level, I think we had a real soul searching as a collaborative, because we realized that we went into this project at the beginning and we were like, we want to think about what might GIS and mapping be able to offer to Holocaust studies. And we realized that we kind of made this default, like almost a kind of unintended choice of the perpetrator archive as the place where you'd find the most objective data. And there's nothing objective about any archive, is there? Like every archive is subjective. Every archive is a kind of demonstration of power. It's kind of like has absences and presences. And I think some of the work was quite critical of the archive. I think Paul, in particular, Paul Jescott, did some really interesting work where it almost was like bursting the hyperbole of the Nazi archive by showing what the Nazis wanted to build and then what they did build and the differences between that. But I think we really did reflect that we kind of gone to the first place for geographical data, to the perpetrator archive, and we trusted the paperwork of the perpetrators as having a kind of scientific value to it. And I think we were like, actually, there's something really problematic about that. You know, like we'd kind of been seduced a little bit by, you know, I think archives are seductive places, aren't they? And if you think of the archive, most historians start at the State Archive, don't they? And the State Archive is a very particular kind of rendering of state power. And the danger is of just reproducing that power through a bunch of maps, isn't it? And so I think we did get to a place, I think, of much more kind of critical self-reflection about that and thinking about what have we shown and not shown, like what archives have we visualized and what archives have we not visualized. And that's where we've really gone, and therefore what spatial experiences have we rendered, not rendered. So, you know, I think we'd really rendered nothing of like sense of place and like emotion and experience. And I think that has been such an important kind of learning for us as a group, is to really grapple with that. And that's kind of all the work we're doing now. It's much more about bringing location, locale, sense of place into conversation and working much more with the vast, you know, oral history archive, which is, you know, where our work really resonates with Todd's own work with the VHA, you know, and the other show, you know, the USHMM archive and Yale Fortunoff and Boda and all those kinds of archives. And there, I think, then you do have to be involved in a conversation about trauma and about what remains unsaid and what is too difficult to talk about and what is too difficult to tell, and therefore just disappears, but actually is really important to reappear in some ways. And I think that's where the stuff on silences I'm really interested in is, I mean, what's most interesting about the pauses stuff is actually less the first slide and the last slide and what's in the middle, which is that what you tend to find is clusterings of pauses. Like someone is incredibly fluent and then just loses it and can't narrate something. And it's normally familial separation, so it generally comes at the time of familial separation around ghettos, deportations, and the actions. So if you just kind of map it on a big scale across 1,000 interviews, it aligns very much with that. And I think that to us is really important to think about, is like actually how do we kind of bring that, the kind of hard, the impossibility of telling even 70 years after an event, like that's an archive in its sense, isn't it? The kind of archive of silence feels like a really important archive for digital humanists to grapple with. And I think that's where, you know, I'm really interested in the book. We could talk more about this on Thursday because it's so present in your book and it's so present in our work. And I think we've come to it in different ways, but we've in many ways come to a similar place. And I think to me, silence is, like, I guess I've always been interested in silences, to be honest, in archives. You know, and silences I think are such a kind of productive, because silences speak louder than words sometimes, don't they? And I think, you know, that's the thing that I think is interesting to me about digital humanities, is that I think digital humanities can actually really be powerfully present around silence. Like, digital humanities doesn't just have to render what is immediately accessible, and I guess that's where we started off from. It can actually work really hard to make the inaccessible more accessible or make silence more visible. And I think that's the thing that I'm really drawn to as a kind of bigger project, actually, which I think is connects in many ways with lots of us. You know, it's not, I mean, lots of us are thinking that way, aren't we? That's the thing that feels like that's a kind of bigger ethical agenda, I guess, for the DH, isn't it?
And of the missing data project
Yeah.
that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This has really been absolutely wonderful, Tim. I know there's probably more to be said. I wonder, there's some food outside. I wonder if we should, we can go out to the balcony, we can talk a little bit more informally, but please join me so much. Thank you.
Thank you.